you're designing your garden, and and this you can do with anything that you're doing in your garden, is just to try and get a feel of how you move around your site. And because each of you all have a pattern that you all will probably follow from the time you get up to the time you go to bed on your piece of land, or in your house or in your garden. And what I do with all my students normally is get them to figure out what their pattern is, because then when you put things around where you go a lot, you have more success looking after them. All right, so it's just a little exercise I'm going to do with you all, is really if you want to draw the outline of your property, whatever you have, and I'll go through it with you.
Is there a marker?
Yeah, just got the marker. All right, so whoever wants to do this can. So you can just draw out your property. So like here at Wa Samaki, this is my property. It's 30 acres. And my house is down here. Right. So when you draw the boundaries of your property, what you also need to do is put in where your house is and break it up into the rooms. And then what we always ask people to do is figure out where your bedroom is, and without taking the pen off the piece of paper, figure out what you do during a day. Alright, so if you start in the bedroom, most people will go to the washroom, go back to the bedroom, go to the kitchen, go back to the bedroom, go to where the TV is sometimes, go back. And people do this all day, and then sometimes they go out into the garden, they come back. And sometimes if you have your car parked here, you get into your car, you go to work, you come back, and you come back and you do certain things. Alright? Now, if you follow this of what you do during the day, you suddenly realize that, okay, well, I spend 90% of my time in this area, and I spend 0% of my time in that area of my garden for the week. All right, so that we do this with people, because if you plant stuff here, 2 weeks later you go back and the bats are eaten everything. All right, or the caterpillar's eaten something, or you forgot to water it and it's all dry. But if you plant stuff here, right away you see something's eating a leaf as you run up and down, and you keep an eye on it. As well as if you have a little nursery and you're growing all your little plants that you want to put in your garden, if you have it where you're going up and down all the time, you can see that things are wilting, you water them all the time. Alright? Now, again, if you follow this, then you realize that if you want a successful pollinator garden, it's good to set it up sometimes in this area and not in this area over here. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? So, I always ask people to kind of sit down, do this on paper, because if you make mistakes on paper, it's cheap to fix, right? If you go and you buy $1,000 worth of plants and you put them down over there because you think there's a good idea, but it's nowhere that you go regularly, you will come back after 2 or 3 weeks. For the first 2 or 3 weeks, you'll go and check it every day. And then life will come around and you will flip back to this pattern where you don't go in the back over there to look at things again. And it'll be a month before you go back there, and you realize when you go back there, half the things are dead. Alright? So we always, when we're teaching people to design around their property, is ideally, if you want something to be successful, put it where you're going all the time. And when you do this exercise, you'll realize that there's areas that you go all the time, and there's areas that you don't go all the time, especially during the week when you might be going to work and coming back. And then on a weekend, you might have a slightly different pattern, that you'll do some things in your garden, or you might just follow the same pattern that you follow during the week, right? So this is what's called a pattern analysis, and it's figuring out how you move around your property. Everyone good with that? Now, if it's your spouse that you're setting up the garden for, or they're going to look after it, then you have to figure out their pattern as well, right? And sometimes their pattern might be different from yours. And just figuring out how they move around their property, or how they move around your property, is if they're going to look after it. All right. The other thing that we always do is, if you have pets, sometimes figure out what their pattern is. Right. So our dogs, as soon as the garbage truck shows up here, they're up and down over here all the time. All right. And we have 12 dogs. So anything that I put along this fence would get destroyed all the time, right? And then we have 14 cats for some reason, and so they can also be destructive, especially around the hummingbird feeders and things like that, because sometimes they're waiting there and the hummingbird comes and they grab them. All right, so, but they're my mom's cats, I have to deal with them, and I also would like a pollinator garden with hummingbirds in it. So again, you figure out where things are going, and then you base things around that. So are people clear with this? It's kind of important. If you're designing for a space that is not yours, it might be a community space, or it might be somewhere else, then again you have to figure out who in that community is going to be helping you look after those plants. How you're going to be sending the people into that space to use it, how often do they use it, just because that will affect the success of you designing a site somewhere. All right? So, like I said, draw the outlines of the boundaries, draw where your house is, or where the space is, where the people move around. And then, so that's called a pattern analysis, where you look at the patterns of people moving around the site. And the next thing I always ask people to do is what's called a sector analysis, and we teach this all the time in permaculture, is just figure out where's north, south, east, and west on your site. Right? Where does the sun come up? Where does it set? Which direction does the wind blow from? Little things like this are really good, because sometimes you might, if you plant certain things here, they will get morning sun, but they won't get evening sun, right? Because the sun goes this way and the house is over here. And in that case, and I've had this problem when I first moved onto this site. We put all the things that love shade in the shady area, and 6 months later, because the sun tends to move, all over there got sun, and all the things dried up, because we didn't design around that site properly, right? So sometimes there are plants that like a lot of shade, that you don't want to put them where there's a lot of like afternoon sun, right? So again, where the sun rises, where it sets. Sometimes if you're in a very windy condition, your plants will get blown down all the time. In Barbados, where I've worked a lot, there are certain sites where just the wind is constantly blowing. Even the quarry that I was working on, where we put some of the hives, the bees could not get back to them because of the wind that was blowing in a certain direction during a certain time of the year. That they were doing well, and then once the dry season came in and the winds picked up, we couldn't figure out why the bees weren't doing well, and then eventually it was just that the wind was too strong in one direction, and once we moved the hives somewhere else, we had a lot more success with them, right? So there's the sector analysis where you look at sunrise, sunset, how the sun moves across your property so that you know where's shady, where's sunny. Realize that in Trinidad the sun moves a little bit north and south during the year, during the winter and summer months. So during the winter months the sun will be a little bit south, and during the summer months the sun will be a little bit north. So again, if you have your house here, sometimes you will get sun here when the sun is north, so that during like June, July, August, and then you'll get shade on this side, but it'll change during December, January, February, that you'll get sun on this side and you won't get sun on that side. So that can affect how certain plants will grow, right? And all of this is just in case you're planting certain plants that I'll talk to you more about, right? Yes, any questions? No? And then the next thing is, so you look at wind, you look at sun, which are the main energies that affect your site. You could look at water. So sometimes when it's pouring with rain, water might be going across your site in certain areas and might be getting soggy in areas, or it might be getting flooded. Keep that in mind of where you want to plant certain things. So sometimes just your neighbors, all the water coming off their roof might be going into a certain area of your garden all the time. That you can either benefit from, and you can plant things that like wet conditions over there, and or you might have to then figure out, well, there's always wet, either I have to put in a drain and drain it out first before I plant my stuff, or it might just get all waterlogged during the rainy season. All right. So that's what we call a sector analysis. It's just looking at anything around your site. Sometimes if there's traffic going up and down in certain areas, it could be an issue. Like if you do have a road here and they are spraying malathion, sometimes if you put things along there, it's always going to be covered in malathion because they're going up and down. Sometimes your whole yard's going to be covered in it, depending on where you are, all right, when they're spraying for mosquitoes. And that can have huge effects on your pollinator garden if you have stingless bees, if you just have regular bees, or if you're trying to, even the birds and the frogs and things like that can be affected by the concentration of what you're using, right? So keep that in mind, that if they are spraying up and down here, then it's likely you're going to have more malathion on this side than on this side, and then maybe it's better to plant away from the road. Right? Also, sometimes if it's just people going up and down, sometimes people jump your fence and grab stuff that looks attractive that you may not want to put things there. All right? These are all real life things that can happen to your site. Right? Yes?
What about light, like street lamp, or your neighbor may have a bright security lamp?
Right.
Them kind of thing.
There are certain plants that will or won't flower if there's a certain photo period. That's the amount of light. I'm not fully aware of them. Shane, you know anything on that?
One good example is marijuana.
Certain plants like poinsettias, certain things that only flower at certain times of the year because there's a long day or a short day, that could be affected. Sometimes the fruit trees that you plant may also be affected, that sometimes they may not flower or they're always flowering, depending on that. But sometimes it's very plant specific, so that if you are noticing that effect, or you do notice that your neighbor has a really bright floodlight here and this corner is always getting light, you might just have to do a little bit of research and figure out what plants don't get bothered by it and work around that. Right?
So just on that note, for our tropical plants, it's been shown that photo period plays a major factor indeed. You mightn't think that because we have lots of sun, throughout the year, but it really does make a difference. Subtle changes are triggers that will cause certain plants to flower as opposed to others. So that's very important for tropical plants.
So again, that can be part of your, what we call the sector analysis, is that one sector of your site, the neighbor always has a bright floodlight over there, and that might affect what you plant. Right? So it's good to just connect, because sometimes people just look at what's in their garden and they don't take into account what's outside of their boundaries, but those things, those forces outside the boundaries might really affect the success of what you're trying to do inside. Right? So that's why we always get people to look at inside, look at their patterns, and then look at outside. And this just helps you get more in tune with what's going on in your garden. Right? Because when you do have a pollinator garden, you really don't want to be using much chemicals or any chemicals in there. So you have to be more focused on little signs that are coming out from your garden that are telling you that this plant's suffering because I need to prune this tree above it. Because sometimes when something's shading a next thing, it's stressed, and you'll always have caterpillars on it eating it down for some reason. And then you prune the tree above it and it has more light and it's doing more. Right? So you have to look at those factors as well. Sometimes you need to do a little bit of research. Right? So, and then the last thing is, what soil type do you have? If you're up in the northern range, you tend to have more of a rocky soil that drains quite well. If you're in central, like us, we're just on clay. The entire site is clay. There's no natural rock on this farm. Any rock you're seeing here came from outside somewhere. It's just clay. And so if you're in the northern range, your garden will drain quite well, the soil will drain quite well. But if you're in central, then you'll notice that during the rainy season, everything turns into slush. And then during the dry season, everything turns into concrete. And it's very hard to work with those conditions. So when we're working with clay, I tend to use, what I actually tend to do for areas that I want more intensively planted, we actually bring in sand and put it on top of the clay. And we mix a lot of organic matter in it, but we don't mix it into the clay. We actually just put it on top, all right, and put lots of organic matter on top of it, So all these beds over here are actually sand on top of clay. And what happens is the clay holds the moisture really good, but the sand lets the water go through it easily, so that when you put sand on top of clay, the clay doesn't dry out as quickly during the dry season, so it holds the water, and the sand on top allows the roots for the plants to go through it easily. Right? But when you mix it, then sometimes you can make bricks and things like that. It just gets hard. So sometimes if you're putting sand onto your clay, don't mix it in. Just leave it on top. Right? And then put lots of organic matter on top of that. That's what we find works. We tend to do raised beds so that you're working on top of the clay, not in the clay. And we use a lot of mulch so that during the dry season, all the leaves that fall on this farm, wherever we can, we gather them up and put them back on the beds. And that helps to really keep the moisture in there and to build the fertility. All right? And as we walk around, and I'll take you all around the garden, we can just take a look at what we're doing. If you're working with sandy, rocky conditions, then the drainage of that sand tends to be good. Sometimes it tends to be too good that it drains out and dries out very quickly, in which case you want to add organic matter into that soil, so that organic matter acts like a little sponge that's holding water in the soil. Right? And we don't burn anything on this farm. We use back all the logs back around the beds, because those logs can hold a lot of moisture in them. So during the rainy season, they soak up moisture, and then during the dry season, they kind of let it out into the beds. Right? And sometimes you can bury the logs in the soil and then build your beds on top of it. And it's like little sponges that you have inside that's constantly feeding water into your system. Right? So just keep these things in mind. And then lots of mulch again. Mulch, when you put mulch on top of your soil, especially during the dry season, it keeps the soil very cool so that it doesn't lose a lot of water. Right? Especially if you trying to, sometimes you may not get water a lot, so that you don't want to spend all your water watering your garden. By mulching, you can keep more moisture in your soil. Right? Any question? Yes.
What kind of mulch would you recommend?
So mulch, it can be just dry leaves. We're now going to go into the dry season. All my cedar trees are dropping leaves. A lot of people gather up the leaves, put in a garbage bag, and send it out. Keep it, all right? That's all the fertility in your land. Keep those leaves, put them around your garden, or if you want, put them in a compost pile somewhere. We also do composting here, and if you're all interested, I can show you all, where you can turn those leaves into compost and then put them back into your soil. Or you can just put the leaves on top of the soil. During the rainy season, you may not want thick mulch because it might increase some of the bad funguses in the soil, fungi. But there are also good fungi in the soil that by putting logs and things like that into your soil, they will help transfer nutrients, create fertility, all kinds of things. All right? So yes, mulch could be leaves. I have someone that does tree pruning for people, and he has a big chipper. And every so often, he will call me and say, I have a truckload of chips, you want to buy them? And I just buy them from him and he drops them here. So it's all the leaves, all the pieces of wood, everything chipped up that we use.
Do you have a contact for that guy?
Yes. I can. His chipper's down right now. When we first started this farm, we could get bagasse. And bagasse was really good while the sugar industry was running, because it was cheap. It was like $100 a load that you could buy bagasse for. And that was a really good mulch that we initially started mulching around this farm. But you don't see that much. Sometimes you can get shavings. Sometimes you can go to a chicken farm and get the shavings that they're clearing out that have manure in them. But some of those you then have to compost because they're very hot and they'll burn your plants, right? And then break it down and then put it around your soil. Yes?
I just have a question, right? As you're talking about mulch, what's your opinion on using wood chip as a mulch and grass clippings as a mulch?
Both are good. Wood chips, if you buy it as a mulch, sometimes you have to be aware that they put a fungicide in it. All right, so that sometimes you buy the wood chips and you put it there and things kind of start dying around it. And I've talked to the people that make wood chips in Trinidad, and they say, yeah, what happens is they don't want to put the fungicide in, but the shop that's selling it when it's in the bag and it starts getting moldy, no one wants to buy it. So they put a fungicide in it to stop it getting moldy in the bag. But sometimes that can be detrimental to what you want. But if you know somewhere that, again, you can even use sawdust and things like that, or shavings, but you have to get it from a facility where they don't have treated wood that they're using.
That would apply to the wood shavings as well, like what you'll get from the sawmill.
Yeah, so the wood shavings that we buy is from someone in Flanagan, and he just does wood shavings for chicken farmers. So they don't use treated ply or anything like that, any chemicals in their facility to, and I can give you those numbers. They're always looking for people that want to buy, so that'll help them as well. But yeah, ideally if you are getting shavings from anywhere, just try and look at the source. It's not a huge deal if you're getting cedar. Cedar is antibacterial and it'll break down slower, but if that's all you can get, it's fine to use. But sometimes the immortelle or some of the softwoods make a better mulch because they break down quicker. But whatever you can get that's clean will just help your soil. Right?
And the grass cuttings?
Oh, the grass clippings, when they're fresh, when they're green, they're very high in nitrogen. So you just want to put a thin layer. Right? If you put too much, you'll notice it's getting smelly and things like that. Right? So you can put a thin layer down, or you can just leave it on your lawn for a day or two to dry. And then when it's dry, at that point you can put it thicker onto your site. Right? Any other questions?
Have you ever used banana leaves?
Yeah. Banana leaves, heliconia leaves, anything that's organic. Sometimes what you need to do, and palm leaves, is set up a log somewhere and have a sharp cutlass and just chop it up and then put it in. All right? Because when you put the big leaves, sometimes it gets messy. And it's the same when you're putting it in your compost. Chop it up, it breaks down quicker. All right? So when you're designing for your garden, there's options, right? So there's what's called the annuals. So those will grow, make seeds and die in 1 year or during one rainy season. And the next year you either the seeds will come back up or you have to plant them back in again. All right? So those, and when you go to some of the flower shops, you'll notice that those are some of the cheapest plants that you buy. They're $5 and $10, but they only last a season and then you have to go and buy them again, right? So those are the annuals. Again, you can put them into your garden, but just realize that they're not going to be there all the time. They're what are called the perennials. So those are things like the vervines, plants like that you plant them once and they're there for 5-6 years, and every year they come back. All right. Sometimes during the dry season, they might drop all the leaves, and then during the rainy season, they'll come back up, depending on whether you're watering your beds or not. There's the shrubs, which are more of the bigger plants. A lot of the heliconias, ginger lilies, you can kind of put in the shrub group. It's just bigger plants, right? But all of those are good for certain types of pollinators if you want to include them into your site, right? And then there's the trees, all different types of trees. A lot of trees. One of the trees that David was talking about, the stingless bees, if you're trying to get your avocados to bear well, they do very well with stingless bees. Right? Stingless bees is one of the main pollinators for avocados. But most trees, even most of the wild trees that just come up in your yard, if you have the space, leave them. If you don't, you have to take them out. But the big trees can have a lot of life around them. All right. So if you have the space, you can look at including trees. If you don't have the space, then sometimes you just have to keep the trees quite pruned. Yeah, this the correlator. I've been trying for like 10 years to get rid of it in one spot, and it just keeps coming back. Like it sends roots down. It's very good for bees and other pollinators, but sometimes if you get a vine in the wrong spot, it just takes over, and then sometimes you don't realize that it's going through all your plants until you pull one end, and then 10 feet down the next plant fallen over because it's wound around there. So if you are dealing with vines, and they're great because they make lots of flowers, is to put them in certain areas where you have control over them. Right? Don't include them into just a general garden. Sometimes set up a trellis in one area let them go up on the trellis, let them stay over there, but you have to manage them, right? Otherwise, you can get into issues. Some vines, like passion fruit, things like that, you can let them wander on your trees. They don't get too thick. And then when the passion fruit ready, it just falls, but the flowers themselves are really good for a lot of pollinators as well, right? And they're pretty, right? So the different microclimates. So again, within your yard, depending on the size of it, where your house is, what trees you have, you'll have areas that have full sun, you'll have areas that have shade, you'll have areas that have partial shade. Different plants like different conditions, so that if you buy something that likes full sun and you put it in a shady area, it'll grow, but it may never flower, right? Because it doesn't get the correct conditions. So things like lantanas, things like exoras, they tend to like full sun, right? So that look for areas in your garden that have full sun and put them there. Don't try and squeeze them into other areas where the conditions might not be right for them. And sometimes wherever you're buying the plants from, they will advise you if this is a full sun plant or if this is like shade. But go through that, all right? And Shane will talk to you more about all the other plants that you can play around. I'm just showing you two, but there's so many different options, all right? There's stuff that like shade. I don't know the exact scientific names of these two plants, but they like shade. If you type in red hummingbird plant in Google, that shows up.
Spike.
It's fire spike.
And pachystachys.
And the pachystachys, right. Okay. So both of those do well in shade. They will flower. And so if you have a shady area that you don't know what you can plant there, these are some of the options, and they're quite easy to grow. Sometimes you just get one plant, you buy one plant, and then you keep making cuttings from it, and you can make more and more. Right? And I can show you what we're doing as well here to make cuttings. Right? So these work well in shadier conditions. If you have wet areas, there are certain plants that you can put in, so that if you have a pond, you can put in water lilies, and you will find a lot of bees will come to your water lilies. Is it for the nectar or the pollen? I'm not sure. Pollen? My water lilies always have, it's probably for the pollen. And then there's things like these, the pickerel rushes. We just put some in. I have them all around the farm in the ponds, but I just brought some in. These always have butterflies around them. And I think it's the nectar that they produce. Right? So in kind of wet conditions, you can put things like this. Or if you have a pond on the side of the edge, on the edge of the pond, you can put things like that, and then in the pond itself, you can put things like lilies, right? So that you're getting variety. Yes?
Just a quick favour, could you just whip back to the shady one for a second?
Yes.
Picture, thank you.
Alright, thank you. And this presentation will be available, so in case people want to review it again, the information's there. Alright, and then if you have a dry area, there's certain types of cacti, even dragon fruit, that will flower, that can attract different pollinators as well. Right? So again, always look at your site. Don't go and buy plants. Don't go and buy plants first without realizing what conditions you have on your site. Because sometimes plants are not that cheap. Especially now, the price of them have gone up quite a bit, that plants are not that cheap. So ideally figure out what your microclimates are, make a little map, and then go to the nursery with that map and say, I want something to go in the shade over here, I want something that'll go in the sun over here, and then they can recommend different things for you. Right? Or you can do some research on it. Right? So also try and figure out what pollinators you're trying to attract. Right? So if you do have a large area, you might be doing it for your honeybees, if you're keeping the Africanized honeybees, the apis. It could be that you're looking at stingless bees. So they would have certain plants that are useful to attract them and to keep them in the environment. And we had all that information presented at some of the previous workshops. So it'll all be available, but we'll have lists of plants that can go in. When we talk about pollinators, a lot of these other insects are also pollinators, right? So wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, they all help pollinate certain things in the environment, so that you can plant things that might attract them. You might have certain plants that attract everything, and when they're flowering, everything is on them. And you'll find other plants that when they're flowering, only certain things will go to them. All right? And this is where you have to do a little bit of research, and hopefully we will have some information available that after this whole project's done, there will be at least a website that you can go to that will have some of this information. Right? And then there's the hummingbirds. All right, so they are pollinators. There's 16 species, I think, in Trinidad, somewhere around there.
19 have been
19?
recorded.
Okay, so there's 19. Some of them are seasonal, so that they only show up at certain times of the year, and then some of them are there all year round. Here in Central, we don't have as high a density as if you go up in the northern range. In the northern range, you put up hummingbird feeders, and sometimes you'll have hundreds of them. Here we get 10 or 20 max. We don't get a huge amount, but we have a lot of other trees that they go to, so sometimes they just don't come to the feeders. Right? And then bats. Right? And the first workshop that we ran here was just on bats. Bats are important pollinators, and you can encourage bats onto your property by doing certain things, which Darshan had talked to people about when we had that workshop. Right. So again, when you're setting up your garden, what are you looking at attracting? Or it might just be, I'm just setting up a garden to attract everything, and I'm just going to put a little of everything in there. Right. Keep that in mind, so that sometimes it's good having a mix of different colors in your garden. You'll have a mix of pollen. Yes, yes. All the purples, definitely. Like even the big bush that turns purple, that has a sandpapery leaf. Anyway, petria. If you'll know the petria, when that is flowering, it's just covered in bees. Right? And they flower. What triggers them to flower tends to be they have a dry period and then a rainy period, and then they all flower out, and then they'll stop flowering, and then you'll get a dry period and a rainy period, and they'll flower again. So sometimes you can get them to flower quite often during the year. There are other plants that will only flower once during the year. All right, so sometimes you need to do research on those plants to figure out, do they flower 4 or 5 times during the year? Do they flower once a year? Or sometimes they might have flowers all year. And those are some of the ones that you want to have in your garden, because it's a constant source for anything that's coming to them. All right? There's also this whole idea of pollen versus nectar. So certain pollinators will go to certain plants just for the pollen, because the pollen has more of the protein in it. And they will go to other plants for the nectar that has more of the sugars. So again, you need to choose plants accordingly, that if you want a pollinator garden that's supporting everything, then you put some stuff that will make pollen and some stuff that will make nectar. Right? And then sometimes at different stages of the plant, it'll have more pollen and more nectar on it. But always just keep this in mind. Right? Try and get both of those on your site. Right, so when you're laying out plants, there's what's called stratification, so that you go for the different layers, so that you can look for stuff that's ground covers. So sometimes you will find things growing on the ground that cover up the ground and tend to keep other weeds away, that have flowers on them, that things will come and get nectar or pollen from. Even watergrass has a blue flower on it that shade it. Certain things go to those flowers. Watergrass.
Watergrass,
Yeah. Right. So even watergrass. Yeah. Our chickens love watergrass leaves, so we keep feeding it to the chickens as well. But in our times, you can actually cook watergrass and eat it as a bhaji, and it has all kinds of good trace elements in it, supposedly.
Make a point out, it has a very small window of opening, so it's only a little more.
Yeah, you'll notice that some plants have very short windows when just they open and then they're gone. The vervines also will keep making new flowers and dropping them within a few hours, and then new ones will keep coming up on the stem. So sometimes when you're going around your vervines, you'll notice it's purple all underneath because they open and close and drop very quickly. Any questions? Okay. So again, when you're designing your garden, if you want to avoid weeds in your garden, sometimes having all of these areas covered means that in a garden like this, because it has a ground cover, it has medium, and it has large plants, there's no extra light reaching the bottom on the ground, so that if there's even weed seeds in there, they don't germinate well and push up, because all those spaces are taken up by plants that you've designed into the site. Right? The more spaced your plants are, is the more chance of other weeds coming up in between, because it's just, you're giving nature that space to put in things. Right? There's sunlight and there's nutrients there, some seed is going to fall there and something's going to grow. If you can fill up that space, then you keep down your weeds. Right? Sometimes it's good just to let the weeds come up in certain areas, because the weeds will attract certain butterflies and certain caterpillars that sometimes a garden like this you can never get them in there, because they would never come to those plants, they only come to certain weeds. Right? So if you do have the capacity, sometimes leave an area weedy, or every so often cut it all down and let the weeds come back. You can have a patch like that if you want, and you'll notice there's all different types of butterflies that will show up over there that you don't see anywhere else. Right? And sometimes it's, people don't want to do that. Right? We have lots of patches like that when you have 30 acres. But even the beds that we set up now, when we first set them up, before we got the mulch to put on them, all kinds of weeds came up. And we selectively chose some to leave because they were attracting certain things. And we took out some other ones that there was just too many. Right? But you can do that as well. You can let nature design your garden. And throughout the temperate areas now, they are going back to all these wildflower gardens. Because one is in areas where there's no rain, these plants do a lot better, so that you can have your whole garden landscape where you don't have to irrigate it, because it's designed to grow in dry conditions. So places like California now, where water is getting more and more scarce, they're actually paying people to take up their lawns and let it go back to wild garden, because it saves water. Right? In other places, there's this whole drive now that to get less chemicals around, because the more chemicals you use in your yard, is the more likely it'll get onto you and into you, and it can have all kinds of effects. All right, either to your pets, your children, you, your neighbors. It can get into the groundwater. It can contaminate all kinds of things. The less the chemicals you can put on your site, the better off for the environment generally. Right? So you have your ground covers, your medium plants, and then kind of your show pieces. So it could be big, pretty plants that you stick in. Right? And just try and design with that. Some people will just have one plant here, one plant there, and the lawn in between. But sometimes maintaining that lawn can be a headache. So I tend to try and fill up as much space as possible and as little lawn as possible. Just other things to consider when you are designing your bed or your garden is if you want to be irrigating it, or if it's just going to be fed by the rain. Right? So that if it's just rain fed, it's good to incorporate logs into it. It's good to have mulch. It's good to have hardy plants that will take the dry weather as well as the rain. If you're looking at a butterfly-friendly garden, you have to realize that butterflies come from caterpillars, right? So if you have caterpillars eating your plants down in one area, they're going to turn into butterflies that you might see in the other area. So sometimes you have to design for both, that you have to put some plants in there that you know the caterpillars are going to eat, so that they will make butterflies for another part. So sometimes when you go to these butterfly gardens that are all enclosed, they will actually buy the pupa, and they will bring them in from all parts of the world, and then they will hatch them, and they will just put the butterflies in there because the plants that they have the butterflies feeding on, they can't have the caterpillars in there. It's too much, right? So again, and there's certain things that will always get caterpillars. Frangipanis. If you all know frangipanis. Is there another word for frangipani? Some people call them cemetery plants as well.
Palmeria.
Plumeria. You'll always get that green and black caterpillar coming and taking all the leaves at a certain point. That's natural, right? You don't have to fight it because the plant's almost designed to be pruned by that caterpillar, and as soon as the caterpillar finishes pruning the plant, it comes back again. All right. So those kind of things. Again, you have to look. If you want monarchs, there's certain types of milkweeds that you can plant that the monarch butterfly, the caterpillars will only eat that type of plant, so that you have to have that plant in your environment, right? Like I said, avoid as much chemicals in your garden as possible, right? There are chemicals that people might spray that will kill the caterpillars, but then you won't get the butterflies. There are certain chemicals that the residues that stay on the plants. Sometimes it can be a week or two after you've sprayed those plants and it's still killing things. All right, and sometimes the beneficial things that are dying, like the honeybees. Whenever you buy a bottle of chemicals, it'll say it'll kill honeybees on it sometimes, or it'll kill bees. People go to the chemical shop to buy those chemicals to spray on bees sometimes, but that's the side effect, so that if you're trying to have a pollinator friendly garden, don't use any of those chemicals as much as possible, right? Farmers tend to spray chemicals on their fields at certain times of the days to not affect the bees, but I don't know how successful that is. Do you know? Like I see people say, you're the official beekeeper, like people will spray in the morning or in the afternoon because the bees are out in the morning, but I honestly think the residue is there all the time. That is probably killing the bees anyway. Yes.
That's exactly what happens when you find something that's for some particular pest, but it will affect bees, and it will affect them through all stages of the plants. It stays in the soil and moves through the plant. So even weeks after, it's going to affect bees through the nectar and through the pollen. That is one of the problems with the new nicotinoids that they talk about. But when you ask the garden shop, say, nah, you can spray that in 2 weeks' time, you're good. No, it doesn't work. So research shows that it stays at least 2 years in the soil and it just keeps going through the plants. That's why they have problems. Places that plant a lot of the rapeseed or heather, whatever it is, they try to encourage the farmers to also plant hedgerows to compensate for any losses of other pollinators. They would have something that natural pollinators would be able to work on.
So yeah, everything in your environment is connected. You have to realize that sometimes you do something here and it's affecting a whole bunch of other things around you. So just be aware of that. So as much as possible, avoid chemicals. Like I say, we don't use any chemicals here. If there's something that needs chemicals to be grown, we just don't grow it here. That's the decision that we've made over here. Like there's certain plants or flowers that whatever you do, something comes and attacks it. I just don't grow those anymore. Mulch keeps your soil cool. It helps keep water in your soil so that you use less water and you have less weeds. And then compost actually helps feed all the life in your soil. Right? So if you have healthy soil, like 1 teaspoon of healthy soil supposedly has 5 billion living things in it, in 1 teaspoon. Alright, so you have to keep feeding all those things in your soil to keep the rest of your plants healthy, because they are doing all kinds of things in your soil. That by putting compost on your soil, you're not only feeding your plant, you're feeding the soil. When you use a fertilizer, it tends to just target your plant. And whatever else is in your soil doesn't really benefit sometimes from the fertilizer being there. But when you use compost, you feed everything. Right? It breaks down slower. Yeah. As long as you keep your soil alive, a lot of plants will do well. Right? You also sometimes need to consider year-round flowering. Alright, so that, again, like I said, certain plants will only flower once or twice during the year. So if you bought 50 of them and put them into your garden, for 2 months you'll have flowers, and then for the other 10 months, there's nothing there for the pollinators to feed on. So by having a diversity of plants, you will have flowers coming in at different times of the year that ideally you can encourage pollinators around your garden all the time. Right? There are certain times when there's hardly any flowers, and they call that the dearth in beekeepers, where at that point you almost have to feed your bees because there's just nothing flowering at that point. But if you can figure out if sometimes some of the ornamental plants, just by watering them, you can keep them flowering all through the year. And that can help you get through some of these hard times, or at some point you might want to put up feeders or feed things. You might want to choose different cultivars or varieties so that, again, like avocado, you can have different varieties of avocados that flower at different times of the year, and fruit at different times of the year, so that if you just plant pollock, they'll all come in at one point. But if you plant some of the other varieties, you can get early bearing, some that bear in the middle of the season and some that bear late season. So that means they're also flowering at different times of the year as well for them to have that fruit. And by putting different varieties of sometimes the same plant in your site, you can get a bigger window from where your things can be feeding off them. All right? Encourage indigenous plants into your landscape. So when you go to most of the nurseries, they will tend to have foreign plants that, well, they just come from away. They're pretty. There's new ones that come out every year. Some nurseries bring them in and they put them out. Some of the new varieties don't make nectar and pollen as much as some of the older varieties because they have mutations in them that give new colors or different color leaves. And sometimes it's very difficult to find indigenous plants. Like when we started this farm, we could not get trees that were indigenous to Trinidad. Like you would get the cedar, you would get mahogany, you would get teak from forestry, but then if you wanted crapo, you wanted locust, or you wanted anything else, it was very difficult to get those seedlings. And I actually had to take the course at Eki out to learn how to identify them, and I had to go in the forest and find them myself. But those kind of things is if you can encourage indigenous plants, you will see many different butterflies, many different hummingbirds, because each plant has its own indigenous, sometimes butterfly or moth that will come to it, right? So just keep that in mind. And then also learn to identify indigenous plants. Anything that's flowering along the roadside, when you see lots of butterflies on it, you can just pick seeds from that and take it to your garden and put it out over there, right? There's lots of things that show up along the road that if you're trying to create a pollinator garden, they're free. You don't have to spend a lot of money on them. You can just dig them up or just get seeds and just sprinkle them in certain areas and they will start coming up, right? So just keep that in mind. So artificial feeding in your pollinator garden. There's different types of hummingbird feeders that you can buy that will bring in hummingbirds. There's different types of bee feeders, right? So there's certain things that you put the sugar water in at a certain concentration and you will encourage different bees to come to it. Sometimes you might realize that the apis bees tend to take over those feeders and they'll drive all the other stingless bees away. So sometimes you have to put a few of them around, or sometimes you have to have them in very secluded areas where the apis bees may not go, which is difficult to do because they forage everywhere. Right? Sometimes if you are doing stingless bees, you actually put the feeder into the stingless bee box so that the stingless bees are being fed inside the box that the apis bees can't come in and get it. Right? It's harder for them to do that. And then if you're looking at moths and butterflies, rotting fruit or fresh fruit, you can use that as feeders. You can just put them up in certain areas and you will see all kinds of butterflies and moths come into it during the day and the night. So that we have a few people that come and study moths here and they will ask me which tree is bearing so that during the night they will come and whatever's on the ground that's fallen, they will find all kinds of moths over there. Right? So again, do your research on what's useful, and then you can put that into your site if you want. So if you're looking at hummingbirds, feeders are good, but if you want to actually encourage them in your site, you need some kind of trees and shrubs for them to nest in, right? They make these tiny little nests like this. They're very exposed. We had one on my mango tree right outside my kitchen, and one day a horsewhip came and took all the eggs. And the mother was there trying to drive it off, but again, that's nature. So you have to have some kind of nesting area for them to be in. Again, low amounts of predators like cats and snakes. And that's difficult in some areas just because you might not have a cat, but your neighbor does. And they keep coming across and doing things. So keep that in mind. And then just having lots of flowering trees and bushes throughout the year so that they always know that if they come to your garden, they'll find something there. And that's the way of them setting up a pattern of showing up all the time. Right? Just different things so that, again, if you're looking at bees, normally they're kept in some kind of hive. That's the apis. If you're looking at stingless bees, you can set up boxes like that for them. You can also, I find all kinds of metal pipes just in areas will attract them just naturally to come and set up. So we have like little pipe frames everywhere just for sheds and things like that where you'll see all the stingless bees show up. They are looking for certain things, and it's normally like a small opening into something else. Sometimes you can even, like a brick wall, if there's little holes in it, you will see the stingless bees set up in there. Right? If you're looking at the solitary bees, sometimes just having a log that has all kinds of holes in it will attract them. You know that sometimes you have a hole in your wall somewhere and some bee will come and fill it with clay. Those kind of bees are called solitary bees. And they're looking for holes anywhere that they can put their egg in and then seal it up. They'll put their egg, sometimes they'll put food for their egg, and then they'll seal it up. Right? So that's what they do. They're doing it in your plugs, in your walls, all that kind of thing. It's actually, they're looking for those kind of conditions. Right? And then things like wasps. You'll notice that we have all different types up here and we just leave them alone. Right? They're all part of the group, and as long as you don't disturb them, they're fine. You just have to be aware that they're there. That's normally the issue that sometimes happens is if you're not aware, then you run into them. Bats. So Darshan had done a full presentation on bats, but things like palms like this that have the leaves below them tend to attract bats. There are people that will actually make cuts in certain trees to create these conditions for bats to be in. And then there's bat boxes that you can build, right? And they have designs online that you can play around with. Or sometimes just having certain trees in certain areas will encourage bats, right? We have a very healthy bat population here, and they tend to keep the mosquitoes down. So we have almost 20 ponds on this land, on this piece of land. But you'll notice there's not much mosquitoes around. It tends to be because we have everything else that's eating the mosquitoes. Because we don't spray chemicals, that tends to balance out. People are surprised by how many ponds, like if you look at that map, all those blue areas are ponds on this farm. But we don't have a huge issue with mosquitoes because we have a lot of the other predators balancing things out as well. Right? So just the pollinator garden that we set up, like initially it's just a sketch and some ideas, and then Jane took that information and we created a more fancy design. But again, you'll notice we have all the palms in certain areas that are creating shade, so that within those areas, and we have a big silk cotton tree here, within those areas we plant certain things, and then areas over here that are in full sun, we have different things planted again, and then areas that are shady, and then we have like a wetland area here that was a pond where we have papyrus, and then we have other types of plants. So that, again, you just want to look for the different microclimates on your site and then put things in there that would be adapted to those conditions. Right? So this is what it started last year. It was just a really bushy place. We weren't using that a lot, and now it's kind of tidied up, and we have all the different beds laid out. And we have an area that you can actually walk through that's dry all year, and I'll take you all for a walk through there. This is Yaret. So I don't know if many of y'all know of Yaret. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Yes. They are in where? Maracas, St. Joseph. They do hummingbirds. Or they set up their whole garden around hummingbirds, and they have literally thousands of hummingbirds. You can go have breakfast, lunch, or tea over there. Pardon? Yeah, they have a lot of hummingbird feeders, but they've also planted a lot of things that attract hummingbirds. That again, they've designed their site, and they make a lot of money from it, right? Because I think it's a certain amount of money that you pay, and you go have tea over there, and you go have a walk in the garden. And again, a lot of people will pay for that experience, which is useful, right? Because you make money by just having all the wildlife right there, right? These are some of the pictures from Rachel, the garden. So Rachel also does a lot with hummingbirds. And again, they have, lots of different types of plants that you just let get bushy, as well as having feeders. And just different size of plants again, alright? So we also propagate plants here because one is we use them on the farm. We also sell plants occasionally. So if you are setting up a hummingbird, you have the choice. Either you can propagate your plants, or you can buy them. Just buy them. Right, so
from friends.
yes, or friends. Okay, friends are always trimming their plants, and you can get cuttings. And if you know what to do with those cuttings, you can save a lot of money. Right? Because nowadays, most potted plants around the $35 range. It could be, some might be 15, some might be 50, some might be 60. But you go with $100, you come back with 3 plants. Right? Now, you could actually grow your own plants if you learn how to propagate. And some of them are very easy, where you just get cuttings and you just stick them in the ground and they grow. Some of them you just put them in pots. Some of them you can set up a gravel bed and you can put the cuttings in the gravel. Some of them you need a rooting hormone that you just dip them in and then put them in. All of those techniques are very easy to learn, right? So always your decision of whether you're going to purchase or propagate. Do you have the resources? Do you have the time? If you are setting up a nursery, it's useful to have some kind of tables that you can put all your plants on. Make sure that you have water that's accessible all the time. Make sure you have shade and shelter, because when you're first setting your plants, they are very tender, so that sometimes just buying a piece of shade cloth and putting it up in a little area will help. Make sure you get your compost soil mixes, and then just make sure you're keeping an eye on it. Labor's around all the time. Seedlings and little cuttings, if you don't water them and you miss one day, sometimes you can lose all of them, right? So just make sure those things happen. And then just the different types of propagation. So you can get seeds for certain things and just sprinkle the seeds or germinate them in little pots. You can do cuttings. You can do air layering, where you actually get the plant and you take off the bark around it. You put peat moss, put a plastic cover over it, and it'll make roots in it, and then you cut off the plant. That's air layering. You can do things like root divisions, so that things like heliconias, ginger lilies, they just grow by sending out rhizomes, and you can just keep cutting off pieces and transferring them into your garden. Right? So again, I could spend a whole day just doing this with you. But just keep these in mind, that if you can set up a little nursery area, it can help you. But if you don't want to go through the bother of this, then you can just go buy your plants in certain areas. And then the last slide is, if you are setting up a pollinator garden, you can try and include other functions into it. Right? So some of the herbs that are really good attractants to pollinators can be like the basils and things like that. You'll see all kinds of bees coming to them. You can have medicinal gardens, so sometimes a lot of the indigenous weeds that attract pollinators also tend to be medicinal. So that you can include those medicinal plants into your site. Right? And then just the food aspect, things like avocados, passion fruit, even the dragon fruit, things like that. You can include them into your garden, and they all require pollinators to be healthy around them to help pollinate them. Alright? So that's it. Any questions? I gave you lots of information.
Yeah, I don't like to get started, you know. But for those who are limited by land,
Right.
like myself, you could grow a meadow in a pot. You
Yeah.
don't necessarily have to have the land
No,
like this.
You can do
So
all
you could have
this
several
in pots.
things in one pot. I mean a 16-inch pot or a trough. You could have all these things in it if you're limited by land.
So again, it comes down to how much space you have. Like you said, you can have, sometimes if you just have space for 10 or 15 pots, and you have the correct diversity in there, you will have things in your garden all year round, right? And we encourage that is just to look at stuff from the pot stage up. It's the same plants, but some of them will just do well in pots. Sometimes you might have to invest in a slightly bigger pot. But in the big pots, you can do some of the bigger plants and have little plants around them, and that will work fine. But again, you should assess your site to see where has sun, where has shade, and then put the pots according to that. Or sometimes you can put a big pot to create shade, that you put all the other pots that like shady things underneath them. And you can play around with those designs as well. Any other question? Okay, well, we can, it's 10 to 11. We can take a break and then just go take a quick walk in the garden that we've set up, and I can just show you all what we've done. And then come back and Shane, how long's Lena's thing?
Ooh, it's about 20 minutes.
Okay, so should I just take you all into the garden there, and then we can come back, you guys can get stuff, and then we can go into the next session? Yeah. Yes? So we'll just